Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think it is just about afternoon. Welcome to Platformland, a conversation with Richard Pope and Emer Coleman here at the Open Data Institute. Really looking forward to the webinar today. Before we actually get started on the conversation, my name's Emer. I'm one of the directors here at the ODI. Welcome to you all. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. There's a couple of housekeeping things that I'd like to go through first. So before we start, we're going to start the webinar in just a moment. It will be recorded and then it's going to be shared via social media, in our email newsletter and on the ODI website, so just to make you aware of that. If you'd like to ask a question during the webinar, if you could please add it in the chat and we'll do our best to answer it in the Q&A session. And we're leaving lots of time this time round in this webinar for Q&A. So we'd really love to encourage people to ask those questions and contribute those thoughts in the chat. So as I said, I think this is going to be a really fascinating discussion on the use of technology in public services, and it's actually really timely. There are so many conversations taking place about how the UK can build up its technology and data infrastructure to better serve citizens and the economy. The ODI is involved in lots of those discussions. I'm sure lots of those of you who are attending today have also been involved. And in many ways, this is sort of the lifeblood of the ODI, which is why this is so exciting today. And I'm so glad to welcome our two guests. So they are Richard Pope, who is an author, consultant and public speaker. And Richard was part of the founding team of the UK Government Digital Service and the first product manager of gov.uk. He actually created many of the original design concepts for both gov.uk and the digital account for universal credit. He was a senior fellow at Harvard in 2018, 2019, researching and lecturing on government as a platform. And he's the author of the recently published Platformland, An Anatomy of Next Generation Public Services, which I highly recommend. It's a fascinating read and very relevant to where we are today, particularly here in the UK, but also globally. I'm also very, very pleased to welcome Emer Coleman, who is a digital leader and business coach and a treasured former colleague of mine. Emer is an experienced digital leader with a background in the public and private sector, and as a woman who's held challenging senior roles from an early age, Emer is passionate about encouraging and supporting other women in business to achieve their ambitions and goals. Emer was also involved in building out the government digital service and also in getting one of the very early ODI incubated startup businesses, Transport API, off the ground and on the map. So it's wonderful to welcome Richard and Emer, and I am, in time-honoured style, going to hand over to them. I think we're going to have about 15 minutes of fireside chat between the two of them, and then the rest of the time we've assigned for questions. So Richard, Emer, I'm going to cancel my camera and pass over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Emma. So yeah, I think we'll kick straight in because we've got a very tight hour and I'm sure lots of people in the audience will have already read Richard's book and have lots of questions to ask. But I was going to ask you, Richard, I mean, obviously you've been doing a lot of publicity, getting a lot of feedback, all of that stuff. I mean, are there sort of three maybe key things that you'd like to talk about if you wanted people to, the main kind of takeaways from your book that you're most keen that people would begin a discourse around?
Sure, I thought I'd give like just 5-10 minutes overview of the three main concepts. So the book is about public services that work much harder for the public, are simpler to build and also accountable and democratic. So I'll just talk to each of those quickly. So services that work harder. I think in the rush to digitize public services, there's little space to ask why we bother a lot of the time. If there is an answer, it's normally financial. So savings from automation, less duplication, that kind of thing. The aim of most digitization programs is the status quo delivered more cheaply, but that efficiency is a trap where even where services are well designed, it's too easy to make them simpler and cheaper for the government whilst also, but they remain fundamentally the same, or even sometimes worse, for the public. Because the things that are complicated and expensive for government are not the same as the things that are complicated and expensive for the public. And it means officials have this incentive to focus on things only where there's savings to be found within the narrow bounds of a single department. So digital rarely gets applied to the bureaucratic frictions between one service and another, or the ragged edges between the public sector and the rest of everyday life. So it means things like, if you want to prove that your child's got a disability in the UK today, you have to carry around a folded up bit of paper from DWP, which is like an award letter for a disability benefit, and people use that to access disabled facilities. And there's whole Facebook groups of people discussing like where we'll accept it and where it won't. There's loads of administrative burdens like that. So if you want to prove your company's VAT registered, you have to remember a number. The land registry has got like a 2-year backlog, I think, when I last checked, because even though they've digitized the back office systems, loads of it's still on paper. And you get this weird thing where services have been digitized, but it's really sort of the paper form that's been digitized. And services don't join up either. So the National Health Service a few years ago was running a poster campaign to scare people, basically, that they might be committing fraud if they claimed free dental care. And it pointed them at a questionnaire where they had to enter the exact mix of benefits they would get. But this is data that government already held. So rather than seeing digital as a short-term cost-saving measure, the aspiration should be to share the benefits of automation with the public more. And the opportunities to do that, which I set out in the book, are better than ever today. So in place of paper letters, we can get digital credentials. We can reuse information using the once-only principle. We can make things at more real time. We can make it so that public and private services can be built on top of common government APIs. But we won't get there by tinkering at the edges. It means that there's a restriction of ambition today. And to unlock that, government's going to have to start to understand where those administrative burdens lie. And it's really going to be a system-wide effort. I think as a first step, just measuring it would be a good start, and kind of starting to give teams mandates to address it. So that's kind of the first thing, like what I mean by services that work harder for the public. But as I also said, services should be easier to build as well. The normal solution to better joined up working in government is through the euphemism of data sharing, but data sharing's more like copying and pasting data. It gets sort of faxing data, it gets duplicated, it's immediately out of date. And if we look to countries like India and Ukraine and Estonia, they've shown the value of organizing data with a bit more intent, with access controls, access via APIs. India's issued 6 billion digital credentials for its digital wallet. France and Ukraine are taking a similar. There's examples of real-time data transfer across borders to reduce trading friction. But that kind of digital infrastructure isn't something that will just emerge from business as usual. As I set out in the book, it's definitely not something you buy in as a single thing. It needs positioning as nationwide infrastructure. It needs, but even though you start small, it doesn't have to cost a lot of money to start. It needs funding for the long term. And finally, the third key message in the book is this idea of making services more accountable and democratic. And so what is that? And that really is, I think that's a big challenge to how we've been designing public sector services and digital services, which have too often been inspired by Silicon Valley minimalism. So if you look on YouTube, there's a Steve Jobs speech where he says, "It just works," 34 times, I think. It's a compilation someone's made. And that's it. That's the approach to the design of the iPad and the iPhone. It's designed to get out of the way. Now, there's one school of thought, I think quite common among designers in the public sector, that it's enough to apply those Jobsian principles and public services should just work. But do we want our services to work like an iPad? So functional, magical, but good luck if you want to understand how it works. I don't think so. And that's the argument I make in the book. The economist Eleanor Ostrom has got this idea of the service paradox, which tells us that the quality of public services, as defined by professionals, tends to lead to bad outcomes for users. So a really, really well-designed textbook that stops students in class having the discussion with their teachers is not a very good textbook. So we should be designing our public services so that they inspire people to have conversations, to understand something of how government works, whilst also not getting in the way. So rather than aspiring to minimalism, I'd argue we should try and aspire to what the late Mark Wisner called beautiful scenes, where the workings of systems are there to be revealed and understood as needed, and users can take control of processes, something that's going to be ever more pressing as AI starts being folded into public services. And that doesn't just apply to to citizens, it's also applies to the role of civil society organisations. So Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, the other day said that civil society groups have a critical role to tell government when they're getting things wrong. But how do they do that when services are digitised? I know when the Child Poverty Action Group was researching universal credit, they had to take on the role of almost like a courtroom artist, sort of leaning over people's shoulders to draw pictures of the user interface because there's no public record of how it works. Just to wrap up, in a democracy, understanding the way things work is a precondition to changing them. But today, the way the public are engaged is as consumers, not as part of a democratic society. Government's designed out the way and it's hidden from civil society organisations. So if we want to make services that are accountable and understandable and trusted, it's going to require a reset of some of the design principles applied in the public sector. Because ultimately, a public service is not an iPad. It should aspire to something greater than that. Hopefully that gives a bit of an overview of the book, but I'll stop there and we'll have a chat.
Thanks, Richard. Because I started reading the book, and I think somebody else made the same comment. They had their highlighter out so often. I thought, seriously, I got to stop highlighting all this stuff. But one of the things that really made me laugh actually was democracy is also user need, because I thought, oh my God, that should have been in there in the GDS design service principles, because it sort of says everything you're talking about in terms of we need to be able to see these processes and understand them a bit better, so they need to be visible to us. But it's a bit of a challenge, I think, to the design community, because it's the opposite of designing out friction.
Yeah, it's like public services only get better through feedback loops from the public. We know that iPhones are successful because people buy lots of them. We can't apply the same measures to public services. Like, they only get better through co-reduction of public value, and we've almost been designing out the opportunities for that, I think. But there's a false comfort in designing something that's just super simple and super minimalist, because it allows you to ignore a lot of the really messy, hard stuff. But actually, that's the job. In public sector design, it's designing it in the context of the institutions and feedback loops that exist.
Yeah, and also, Richard, you could argue that if the same was true of Facebook and Google, designing out all of the conditions by which you were actually using their services, what that data would be used for, where it would be used against you, understanding the impact on democracy, all of those things were kind of hidden from us because we don't want that aggro when we're just accessing something on Facebook. But you could argue the private sector should as well be as transparent in outlining those terms and conditions that are visible in front of us, so we make informed choices.
Yeah, I mean, definitely things that are more like de facto monopolies, essentially. Like they do get very close to demanding the same kind of approach, I think. I agree.
Yeah, and also going back to, I think one of the things that's become more prominent in the last year and a half, maybe, is this whole concept of digital public infrastructure. Whereas suddenly it seems like there's a rush. I mean, we've been talking about this since 2010, talking about things like when we set up the London Data Store, all of that stuff. You would have assumed, it's 15 years ago now, we'd be much more progressed towards a robust digital public infrastructure in the UK. What are your views, on where the UK is currently around digital public infrastructure? And certainly with the opportunity of a new government if you were to give them some advice about what they could do now, what would be the kind of baby steps you'd take?
I mean, not to take anything away from the good work that Government Digital Service and people across central and local government have done, we can't say that the UK is ahead on this anymore. We're just not. There are some good platform-shaped things within central government. They're slowly being applied a bit into local government, but it's still very inward looking. I think the reason digital public infrastructure as a concept is very useful is because the starting point is that they are society-wide platforms. So it's not just for government of the centre or central or local government. It is for the whole of society. So it's really valuable from that respect. But the UK is not there at the moment. Not yet. Not there at the moment. Definitely. There's good work going on, but can we say that the UK has a mature digital public infrastructure? No, we can't.
No, and if you were to say and you say, of course, you need funding and all of that stuff to do that, but given the status quo as it is now, is there some place that civil servants, political leaders could say, we need to go in this direction to ensure that we're starting to put that robust infrastructure in place? What would be the one thing you'd do tomorrow if you were advising the government?
I think the place to start, partly because it's additive, partly because I think it unlocks a lot of it could unlock some demand from the public for digital services as well, would be credentials. So thinking about the systematic digitization of credentials. So not just a driver's license or a proof of address or something like that, but everything from disability living allowance certificates to library cards to free school meals, like things that will allow the public to join services up in new ways and actually create demand on government. Because the second people have got these things in their hands, they're going to start going, well, why can't I use this to why can't I use this to join these two services together? So I think that would be an obvious place to start.
Do you think that's an achievable thing, or given we talk about how long it takes for these things to actually happen, is it achievable? What's the kind of time frame would you say that something like that would be achievable?
I think digital public infrastructure is a function of ambition to some extent. Technology is not necessarily that hard. It's hard to see how you do that within the current ways of working in the public sector. If you get the political ambition to start small, grow, really back these things, it's totally achievable. And India and Ukraine and various other countries have shown this. You don't need to spend a lot of money to start, but you need the ambition to start and the intent to fund things for the long term.
And do you think there's a danger, obviously you reference in your book, you talk about COVID and the attempts that were made by tech giants like Apple and Google, where there were points almost where people were thinking, is this a message from the government? Is it from these tech giants? What's the danger of disintermediation within the DPI kind of context of those large tech companies saying to government, we'll do this for you, and all of the implications that we know about that will bring?
So I think that's a risk at the service layer, and it's a risk at the infrastructure layer as well. I think COVID's a really great example where, and this is not to say that the technology that Apple and Google created was not the right one, but through the creation of their APIs and their data standards, they restricted the policy options that democratic governments and undemocratic governments had. There was a space that they were able to play within. And we, like you referenced, we ended up with this very weird situation where, certainly as reported at the time, there were messages going out to people that appeared to be from the government and actually from these big tech companies. If governments don't shape this space, they will have it shaped for them. I think I end the book kind of talking about big P politics a little bit. And actually, I think we need politicians to understand the affordances and the political economy that platforms and digital services make. Because if they don't, they will end up restricted in their abilities to act on all of our behalves.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I love your quote, software is politics, and you've been writing about that for a long time, including during your time in Harvard. And do you think that people are beginning to get a better sense of what that means? Because that can seem quite a high level concept. Do people understand, for example, what's happening? We have Musk practically with his feet under the table if Trump gets in. So, do people understand the threat to democracy? All of this stuff. Do they understand that concept, or do you think it's still very far away from?
I think we collectively do, and then keep on getting surprised by it at the same time. So, obviously, the Facebook allegations, how many years ago it was now, that was a big kind of point. I think people realized, the internet's suddenly not your friend quite as much as you thought it was. But I think we kind of keep on going through these moments a little bit. I think talking about it in terms of political economy is quite an interesting one, because we can then start to think about it as, and that's what I mean by software as politics. It's about distribution of power in society. It is a mechanism to distribute power, and the likes of Musk, they realized that a long time ago. But not that it just applies at that kind of big, kind of political campaigning level. How we choose to join up services, which ones we choose to join up, who we give the ability to appeal and not appeal, which bits of the system we hide, which bits we show. Those all they shape power in society, and I really want politicians to grasp that and use it as a material, hopefully, to for good rather than anyway.
Yeah. And just looking at some of the questions are starting to come in, but there's an interesting one here, because so in your book you talk about what India have done, what Estonia have done, pointing at these examples. But you say in the book, it's not enough to do in Estonia or to do in India, because all of these places have different cultural references, different cultural preferences, different approaches to different types of governments. We have one question here from Claire Robinson, who says, do you think that the UK public discourse has a particular aversion to digital government platforms, i.e. a big pushback on ID cards, aversion to sharing health data? I mean, you know, Estonia has the digital identity for everyone. That was a huge pushback culturally in the UK against that, about overreach for government. So do you think there's a cultural barrier there that's specific to UK?
I think there's cultural barriers everywhere, but the job of politics is to figure out like what the accommodations are. So we've kind of, there are some things we know about technology and some properties and some affordances of it. Like, how do we shape those to like our society is the question at hand, I think. I think sometimes it does get misread, and it doesn't help in the presentation sometimes of digital services, but there's a sort of suggestion that everything will be centralized. That does not have to be the case. I think we can make a case for a much more networked public sector, one that does have accountability designed in, does have opportunities to help users understand what is happening to data about them. Doesn't mean they get to choose every single time. You don't get to choose whether your points go on your driving license or not, but you make sure people know that it's happened. So we don't have, I think resetting it from centralizing everything into one place, as is sometimes how I think it's understood, to something that is much more networked with appropriate counterbalances in the system, with civil society organizations playing a role to understand and solve problems. We really got to think about it in the whole.
Yeah. And do you think, was another questioner here, Paul is asking, sort of, is like the development of DPI relevant in both developing countries and developed countries? So for example, in Estonia, I mean, the Russians left, they took everything, you know, you had an opportunity to really start again from scratch and to leapfrog over somewhat. You know, is the legacy situation, in not just the UK, other countries as well, very difficult to break? You know, is that an impediment to innovation in a way that in developing countries it might not be?
I think stuff's hard everywhere. It's interesting, isn't it? Because people used to go, Estonia used to be the only reference point. People go, oh yeah, but it's really small. It's like the size of Birmingham. It's really, it's easy. You know, it's suggesting it's easy, ignoring the fact that like people worked incredibly hard and were incredibly smart. And then you've got India, the other end of the scale, and like has also created some digital public infrastructure. Other countries are doing it too. It's not. It's a matter of political intent in the first instance. It's also a case of like, what's the one thing I think we know work? Like looking at digital, we've been following digital in the public sector for a long time now. I think I would say the thing that we know works every single time is you get a team of smart people, you put them on a problem, and you start small and you grow. Like that works, and that's, you know, that's what happened in Estonia. That's what has happened in India. That's what's happening in the US, looking at the replacement of so people can do self-filing of tax returns. All of these things are examples of small teams with a mandate growing over time. So it's totally achievable here in the UK if there's a political intent and we start in the right way.
Great, thanks, Richard. I'm just looking through the questions. There's one provocative question here, I think, around design. So Mark Gannon is saying, why do you think so many digital teams in public sector spend most of their time in discovery without delivering substantive change? Is that because they come to a bottleneck, right? You know, you can only do so much.
A bit. I'm sorry, I get myself in trouble. I think there's it is not acceptable that there are 6 and 9 month discoveries in the public sector where at the end of it we go, well, we're not sure. Or here's a grand plan and we don't know how to deliver it. And like too often, I'm afraid that is the case. That is what happens. Now, the reasons for that, it's partly about design culture, it's partly about the political setting, it's partly about what's easy to fund, it's partly organizations like doing discoveries because it means they don't have to change anything. But it does need a reset. So we need to move towards some different delivery patterns within the public sector. The ones you use for a legacy system are just going to be different from creating a bit of new public infrastructure. They're going to be different from a new service. So we need some more mature delivery patterns. And I think the bias has to be towards delivering value early. So the question that senior leaders should be asking all of their teams, especially if they've been into discovery for a long time, is like, what's the one bit of value we can start delivering now that will help us learn, and we can do the rest as we go.
One specific question Tim Lloyd is asking here is, how much of a barrier does departmental friction continue to present to good services? So, at the time, in terms of delivery of Gov.uk, that was really the, standing down of those to try and give this single voice to government, this single, front facing. Do you think departmental friction is still an element of impediment to good services being delivered, designed?
And in lots of different ways, I think. So I think the question is actually, you hit on exactly there. Gov.uk was a new thing with a new team and a new mandate. So how do you create more things like that? Not within the bounds of a department, which is kind of what's happened in the past. We're going to look at trade across the border. Okay, we're going to create a new team, but that team is going to live within one department. So you need new cross-government teams. Maybe these government mission teams can be those if they've got the right kind of mandates, maybe. I think we also need to look at how data is exchanged between different parts of government as well. At the moment, there's the default is data sharing and data sharing agreements, but that is really one organization asking another organization to spend money. It's like, hello, we're doing a project. Would you mind spending some money on our project for us? There needs to be a mechanism for teams to request access to APIs, for APIs to be created, and there be a reasonable expectation that will happen, and funding needs to follow that across government. Whereas at the moment, what happens is you only get these data sharing agreements either where there's a big, as like happened with universal credit, there's enough political capital to make it happen, or the interests of two organizations align, but that's not always the case in service delivery.
Yeah, so it's an issue really about, looking at the structure of government and how that is operated and how it has always operated, as if these things like health or, transport or all of these things are like separate things, when actually they all end up in a big mess, don't they? That we can't really delineate that neatly between those things, but government still structures itself as if those things are separate and discrete things. I mean, I remember the time when the Connected Digital Economy Catapult was set up. I thought, well, that's ridiculous. You can't have a disconnected digital economy. But, in a government sense of setting up something like a transport, a smart cities, etc., as if all these things were different, right? And they're not. They're all part of the same thing.
Yeah. I think, how do you get people to think in a more networked way? And I have a hunch that I think the design of services will be, the design of the next generation of services will demand that a bit more. I think we're not going to be so much in the world of like a single website, a single app. These things are going to start fragmenting a little bit. And how do you design a single experience that means that so when you're interacting with your school, it joins up with the tax-free account that the government gives people for childcare. How do you make interacting with a library feel like a digital experience, so that someone can book a study space when they're revising for their GCSEs? It's like we need to start thinking about a digital society and how it is networked together.
Yeah.
I totally
agree. And that's not to say, for example, that tech companies, although we give out about the toxic side of tech companies, that's not to say they don't have a role in also developing services. Once the government has set the DPI sort of infrastructure in place and funded it and has its rules and access agreements in place, they have a role to play. However, another questions come in. Given that we need new thinking everywhere, what's your view on the continuing reliance on the kind of Oracles and the Microsofts of this world in government, who are not known for innovation, are not known for that type of network thinking? Their business model is the opposite. So, how do we make that change?
Yeah. I mean, it depends in what area, doesn't it? I think. I mean, like commodity stuff, it's kind of okay. People got Windows laptops.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think if you've got, as has happened in the past, you get big tech companies who are very good at carving up, trying to slice up as much of an organization's technology into a single implementation. Under the guise of it being buying off the shelf, and we know it isn't.
Yeah, and it's kind of horses for courses, isn't it? Like, so when we were trying to release data from the London data store, and we needed to get it out, via API that it wouldn't crash transport API systems, both Google and Microsoft came forward and said, we'll take the data load. And all the developer community were going, go with Microsoft, because they're not innovators, right? They're for scale, which is exactly what you need. You need to be able to distribute the data at scale, but they didn't want to feel somebody was going to try and reverse engineer what they were going to do. So it's horses for courses, I guess, with those companies.
Yeah, but I think that's the thing, like the fact that we're still in the position as a wider public sector that you were in when you were in the data store, where you've got to beg and borrow to ask people to create APIs. It's not just the assumption.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think one thing that we public sector government can be thinking about is how do you start to shape those markets a bit more? How do you start to set the expectation that there's going to be an API and it's going to meet a standard? So if those companies want to come and play in a particular space, it's going to have to meet. You're publishing transport data, it's going to meet this transport API. It's going to, if you're publishing data for the planning system, there's good work going on in MHCLG around this, like from what I saw at Service Design and Gov the other week. You're going to meet this standard. Like those sort of interventions, those sort of market shaping interventions, could be really valuable. Again, they require policymakers to understand that political economy.
Yeah, so more integration of that work, really, more discourse and more network discussion. I agree. So is another question coming up saying public bodies have duties to protect data, but generally don't have specific duties to positively gain public benefits from data and to build public digital assets. It says to help get beyond a view of digital transformation as the same things but cheaper. So I guess that's an observation rather than a question. Let me see what else is coming in. A question from Helen Nichols is saying, how can UK government ensure that this works for everyone? Minorities, communities can have a different relationship with the state, particularly with sharing data. So I guess, what are the protections that need to be there, particularly why government should do it rather than big tech?
Yeah, I think actually you end up, I've kind of heard these recurring memes in like having worked in the public sector for long enough that people even say, people don't care how government uses data, everyone expects it to be used anyway. And then other people at the other end of the spectrum are like, no, we can't share anything because there's risk. And both of those things can be simultaneously true, and it's okay. What we need to ask ourselves is like, where is there a potential for harm, and where can we build a positive understanding of what the state is doing with data? And that means you need to design these things that in a way that do help people understand what's happening and why, and give people alternative routes to it to access services as well. I think one thing I've been wondering recently is, like, to the extent how much has treating digital inclusion as a separate thing made it remain a separate thing? So
I agree with him. Yeah,
amazing things that happened at GDS in the early days was that accessibility stopped being this extra thing. Accessibility in terms of like design of accessible interfaces stopped being this separate thing and became a function of how design was done. Can we make the same true of digital services? So it's an expectation that you can go into a council service centre or a library or a job centre and get assistance with a digital service when you're stuck, and anyone can do it. And that's either because you find technology hard to engage with or unable to, or because it's really complicated and you're dealing with a load of stuff at once and you just need help. Can we design those things in, like designing more human into the system so people can get help when they're stuck, or have very valid reasons not to trust the technology?
And on the design issue, Richard, because I did a word count through your book, and design is mentioned 185 times, and technology is only mentioned 45. So do you think on balance you've written a book about design or about technology? Or are they all the same?
Probably about design, really.
Yeah. But did that surprise you when you were writing it or not?
No, because that's the thing I've always really cared about, is the design of services rather than the tech. And even when I've kind of written and talked about technology and platforms, it's been from a point of view of how do you help people understand it? How do they fit in? What's their interface to the world? So no, it's not surprising. Maybe surprised other people, but it's.
I have one question here from Carl Haggerty. He's saying, given all you've said and written, if you were a local authority CEO facing the inevitable financial emergency crisis, what would you prioritize and why?
I don't know. I did see a striking figure, but someone tweeted yesterday, not tweeted, blue skied yesterday, around, you look at the makeup of local authority budgets is social care now. Trouble is, I don't know how, these are And there's a really tricky problem here to be thought through when it comes to digital. Like, I think there's a risk of over-promising the extent to which digital can improve what is essentially services based on a human relationship, and actually understanding like things that are genuinely human-shaped services, like what's the role of technology in those. I think we don't really know the answer to a lot of the time, sadly. So I'm not really answering the question directly there. What would I do if I was a
local government CEO? Is like, is there a particular area that you say, do this? I mean, do you ever go into organizations, Richard, where you just go, would you just do that?
I think they need to understand like how much they're able to change their current technology. That's the main thing. Like,
right,
getting to a place where you're able to change your existing technology has got to be the starting point, because until you have got some mastery over that, then everything else is just, I think, again, it's why some local authorities can fall into this inevitable trap of kind of doing discoveries and doing kind of the design work side of things, is because they can't really change a whole lot. I think that's got to be the starting point, is like what's within your control and what are you able to.
Yeah. Somebody else, Stefan, is asking you a question. He says, not a designer, but please forgive the question. He's saying there was a similar argument in the book To Save Everything, Click Here. That there's, we need a shift of mindset. So what he's asking is, do we need a design approach that's more based in philosophy? More holistic kind of design-based approaches? Do you think that's required? Like, so a similar question I would ask is, we talk about designing in the seams. If this is a change for designers, do we need specific designers who design for the public sector? Knowing that, I mean, you don't need to know that necessarily if you're designing for John Lewis, but if you're designing for University of Creda, are they different people now?
Oh, I mean, I hope they wouldn't be. I mean, we've already got people who are building careers in public sector design. That is amazing. I think we haven't yet articulated what public sector design is effectively enough. I mean, maybe in the future it's a thing that, you choose one path, you choose the John Lewis path or the government path. I don't know, probably not. But we've not currently articulated what it is. What it is to design services that are accountable and understandable, like how we design opportunities for feedback and understanding into services. So something that happened with GovUK, and I don't even know how it's really happened, but it ended up like the GovUK branding ended up being used on court services, which are, thinking about separation of powers. I know we don't quite have it in the UK in the same way.
Yeah.
But the courts are kind of independent of the central government. They ended up the same thing. And no one thought, until some lawyers saw it and then said, what on earth do you think you're doing? People are potentially using this service to sue the government, and it's got the government's the title of the government's website at the top of it. And it just obviously didn't occur to anyone, because the defaults for design is, let's make it simpler, let's remove concepts, let's make it so people don't need to understand what's happening. So yeah, we need to reforge what public sector design means. I think now feels like the time to do it.
Okay, and there's another question coming in about design again, saying, how do we incentivize service teams to follow the kind of patterns you describe? The vision seems to resonate with pretty much everyone I've spoken to, but teams are incentivized to focus on just their domain. So how can we realign the incentives for people working in government?
I don't know. I think so. If you think back to the time of the London Data Store and Hack Days and all that, Rewind State and all that kind of stuff, there was more ideas in the open. I think let's say, like, people were talking, they were blogging, they were looking sideways a bit more. Can we recreate some of that in the public sector? I know but then are people going to be given permission to do that? No. Are they going to be told off if they do it anyway? No, probably not. Just like, so actually a bit more of it just kind of grassroots would be good. And I think, a bit more from a grassroots would be good, but also a lot of it does come down to the next generation of digital leaders. Are they going to enable, like, start asking for this kind of thing? Start asking for, okay, how are civil society organizations going to understand this? How are we helping the public understand what's happening when their information is going from welfare to health or whatever?
Yeah, and then another question again around that, like, somebody's asking, until policy is more user-centered, design of services will struggle to make real impactful improvements for users. So what are your thoughts about user-centered design, getting more of a place at the table where policy is created and strategies defined? You know, design can be kind of cut off a bit, whereas it should be central, but it should be central to the politics of it as well, right?
Yeah, I think I don't think that's about designers having a seat at the table, which I think is a kind of constant thing. I think the question should really be, how do you make it so that the affordances of digital are considered at the point of policy inception? Because sometimes it's not about design. It's about, okay, you're thinking about a new tax. Historically, the only way we've been able to think about taxes is through bans that we write in legislation, actually digital, in very different ways. You can solve problems in new ways using digital technology, which design is a part. You know, digital services are very good at abstracting away complexity. For example, it's very anyway. So I don't think it's about designers having a seat at the table. I think it's about when policy and digital are considered at the same time, like right back to all legislation.
And then again, it's you know, you talk about very deftly in your book the notion of administrative burden, which when I read, I thought, is he talking about politics there? Really? You know what? You know, so you know, some things are built into the system or deliberate. Maybe sometimes they're more by accident. But where do you see politics changing in this? You know, we need politicians who are very versed in this, and often they don't come from backgrounds that enable that. Really.
Yeah. So for people who haven't read it, administrative burden is this concept. I recommend there's a book called Administrative Burden: Policy Making by Other Means, if people haven't come across that. It describes administrative burden as 3 types of costs. So there's learning that a service exists. There's compliance costs, like filling in forms, and there's the emotional cost of doing things, like how it makes you feel, how it makes people feel. Digital gives new opportunities to kind of remove some of those burdens, but it also does give some new opportunities to create them as well. So, and I think there's elements of this in universal credit, which I've described in the past as like a hyper means tested benefit. You can use more data points if there's more data points out there. So how do we get an accommodation, the right kind of balance between using digital to remove burdens and add them is ultimately going to be a political choice again.
And I mean, one of those examples of a burden for people who might not be as familiar is, you know, where government make assumption, for example, that everybody's paid by the month. So they have a month of income that they can store up if they're applying for benefits. In actual fact, that's not the case. They end up, therefore, borrowing from the government and are in debt to the government before their benefits even start, based on that assumption that everybody will have a month because they're paid by the month. I mean,
yeah. And it's like, was that intentional or not? It kind of was, because partly a misunderstanding of how a lot of people earn money, but it was also an attempt to try and form people into a particular way of living. The way that I think, again, because digital is a bit opaque sometimes, we don't have a healthy debate about what those trade-offs and political decisions are. So we get this digital fog around things like universal credit, and around sharing of health data, actually, or reuse of health data, where it's not clear what's happening. It's not clear what the political motive is. It's not clear whether it's coming from the technology. So we have this really poor public debate about what's happening. I think greater transparency, greater accountability, more opportunities for more people to understand how systems work is a good thing and will lead to a better, healthier debate.
Okay, I have lots of questions coming in here. Thoughts on the new digital center by DSIT? Is this to start small, get smart people in the room and grow from there?
Yeah, I think so. We'll wait and see.
That's a very diplomatic answer, Richard. Let me see how else. So another question Neil has asked: how do we get over the old chestnut of stakeholder influence, in this case politicians, dragging things down or in the wrong direction? You know, that's a skill, isn't it, to try and be able to, you know, make that change with politicians who may not be familiar with something you're trying to explain or the impact that it's going to have, etc.
So there's still this, possibly a fair one, but there's an inbuilt assumption in a lot of digital teams that you see that we're going to be asked to do the wrong thing. And the defensive stance has got to be, we can't let anyone tell us anything because it might be the wrong thing. I wonder at what point that changes as you start to get politicians who are a bit more clueful about technology, who do, and there's more examples around the world for things like digital public infrastructure, and there's more people, studying these things at university in public policy. There are lots of public policy courses that have a digital element to them now. Like, at what point does that start to shift and you start getting kind of like the quality of the requests coming in starts to be quite good? And how long did the digital teams remain on a defensive foot for too long, I wonder? Some of it kind of speaks to that point though, like if you can bring digital into the policymaking process earlier, and hopefully you get designers and technologists and politicians and subject matter experts working together.
Yeah, because traditionally too, the voices talking about data as infrastructure, for example. I mean, ODI were talking about that again more than a decade ago. Gavin was talking about that all that time ago. You think, why has this not become the drumbeat out of government itself? In a sense, a lot of those civic activists, a lot of agencies like the ODI are on the outside to a certain degree of government. It's interesting that it hasn't become more mainstream within government.
Yeah, worrying actually. I mean, one of the things I say in the book, which is not the totality of the reason, but like I think it's part of it, is that with digital and data are still treated as this kind of special thing outside of the normal world of policy making and government delivery. They're kind of a special thing. And actually, back to the question about the digital centre, like that is an opportunity, if nothing else, to kind of reset that. So as a result, it's quite easy for big technology companies to come in and go, well, we won't use the language of technology that's kind of scary and hard to understand. We'll wrap it in euphemisms and we'll make it, we'll almost like reinforce that idea that it's separate and otherly from the rest of the public sector.
Okay, you've frozen there.
Oh no, I just my point petered out. Sorry,
Richard, you just froze there slightly.
Sorry.
Okay. So the question here is saying, what are your thoughts on recognizing that those administrative burdens already exist in non-digital services? And without considering these burdens, we recreate the biases and inequity in those burdens. Work and health has an important debate around reducing inequality and the way that, for example, new digital services and/or AI may recreate existing burdens and bias or exacerbate them further. I mean, I think that's a huge concern around AI and the speed with which it's both being rolled out without guardrails and the amount of people who are experimenting and playing with it and what those implications are.
Yeah, I think so. Administrative burdens definitely exist in the analog world. Yes, like, can they get duplicated? Absolutely. There's also an administrative burden for things that don't get digitized, I would say. So if you look at the service, there are a whole host of things which you can only still do on paper in this country, and they tend to be things that are either too complicated to do digitally or perceived to be, i.e. expensive, or it's not worth the organization doing it. So if you want to apply for, the numbers are so low that there's not an incentive for the organization to digitize. We end up with lots of things where there's an administrative burden created by the fact that people would want to do it digitally and can't. When it comes to applying AI, I think this needs a total dose of realism, and just since we don't yet know what AI is going to be good at within the public sector. It is going to help in some ways, it's going to hinder in others, but we need to be humble enough to say we don't know and set ourselves up to test and understand what works, understand what its role is, and understand what the trade-offs are.
Are you concerned at all, Richard, that it's going to be like the blockchain problem? I'm sure you will remember well when we were in GDS and all the permanent secretaries going, blockchain sounds like a fabulous thing, let's have those. And you're like, oh my God, you can't even, get your laptop open in less than 20 minutes. Like, what are you talking about? So, this idea that there's going to be a panacea for everything, and now AI is saying, oh, let's have more AI.
Can you think of a single service now that is live anywhere that uses it, or rather, its defining point is?
Yeah. No.
But
these things.
But are we going to end up in that place in 4 years' time with AI? I don't think so. I think it is a different category of thing. I think.
And do you think consumers are more? I mean, I'm only using blockchain because crypto, the same thing. That became something that the media were very fond of, and everybody's talking about blockchain. All those. One senior partner in Ernst & Young said to me once, he said, I think it's a bit like teenage sex, like they're all talking about it, but nobody's doing it. So, you know, or do you think there's more caution now, not only within government, but more generally in the populace about what AI really means? I mean, do you think people are getting up to speed faster, is my question on.
I think that the hype is similar, but I think the place it will end up with, we will end up with AI-powered public services. Absolutely, it won't quite be like blockchain where they disappear to nothing. But there is definitely hype at the moment. We just need to find out where they sit. And there's some kind of quite philosophical questions there around, is it going to sit in between the public and public servants? Is it going to sit alongside and help them both understand each other better? What are the roles where it's not okay to apply it to? So using AI to spot common mistakes in paper forms that are submitted in to reduce a backlog is probably a no-brainer. Using it to summarize what a doctor is saying to a patient, like something that requires an understanding on both sides in a human relationship, I don't think we know yet. So I think where we choose to position it and how we choose to measure the risks, I think is going to be the important thing. It will absolutely play a huge part in the future, but I think claiming we know exactly where it's going to be positioned at the moment, I think anyone who says that.
Well, as a technology stroke designer, then are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future with AI and data and public services?
I'm optimistic, and I actually think that the public sector, if it can get its act together, is the place to test these things. I think if we just leave it to the private sector to develop these systems, we will end up with things that do not align with our political values. So it's absolutely essential that they end up in public services, and that the public sector has the capacity to, in a humble way, understand where they fit and create its and decide where they should fit in public service delivery.
Yeah. Okay, I've got another question coming in specifically relating to education. Jill is saying she works in education and they're moving a bit more faster in how they're thinking about learning design. Said we're now learning design, not tech design for learning. There's a replication and use of tech for doing things more efficiently, but not real change in learning design. Data sharing and micro-credentials are moving things along. On the demand-led side, we need to have short courses and learning that's agile and lifelong learning. So she's saying AI has real potential for digital human elements, but she's asking the questions, are humans less biased than AI? I don't even know the answer to that. So the question is, are humans less biased than AI?
Let me have a qualified to answer that. We will be biased in different ways, won't we? That's the thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Education is an interesting one though, because if you think that, like, back to your question about disintermediation earlier, what is the role of public sector design in the education space? So you were kind of in the UK, we've got GovUK, there's an app kind of rumored there. The NHS have got an app. There's a digital property that exists in healthcare in England and in kind of public in central government. Like, what is the equivalent in the education space? Doesn't mean there's like one thing or a single app, but like at the moment it's kind of a bit of a Wild West where you've got lots of very suboptimal private sector provision of tools that don't quite work for anybody, waste loads of teachers' time, and they should be, but they can be spending either, not working in the evenings when they're filling in forms or teaching students. Like, how do we think about that in a wholesale way? Because what's there at the moment is totally suboptimal. It's a bit like, back office systems in councils and doctors' surgeries. Like, there are areas that governments historically have chosen not to intervene. They could in the future.
Yeah. And do you think, on that question of AI generally and societal impact, is it that the government has a role to play in an educational way around the potential harms that can happen? Because really that's left to civil society pretty much, from what I can see. Isn't it time that the government started really taking on board, advising people what the impact of all of this is on democracy, on learning, on the future of work, or do they not know as comprehensively as they should?
I don't think I can answer that. I don't think I'm expert enough to answer that. I would say, but there's the opportunity with public services is to show what good looks like in new ways. I think the risk of kind of public service campaigns. I think the way to do it is to show what good looks like. To make sure that it's a matter of public record how digital systems, whether they use AI or not, work, how they're changing, invite civil society organizations to critique how they're working. And then actually, people might start to compare, okay, public services work like this. Facebook, I've got no idea. There's kind of, you start to show what good looks like, and then hopefully there's some spillover into the private sector.
Yeah, I agree. We have a question here from Chris Thorpe. How do we as a community help politicians to understand the value and perils of emerging fields, such as using AI to understand disease treatment from bulk electronic records and to understand problems such as the identifiability of individuals with rare diseases? Pharma companies are brilliant at lobbying. How do we as a community get better at lobbying and learning how to influence or even be better at the table? I think your answer is probably a showing and telling, right?
Bits of that. I mean, it's hard to do because, I mean, the thing that's changed since thinking back to London data store days and kind of pre-GDS, you know, those people who are involved in those communities were mostly outside of government. A lot of those people are now inside.
Yeah.
So and rightly, how much can you lobby from the inside? Yeah, it's a different dynamic. So I think it's a good question to ask. Like, who should be doing that? Is there a missing body there that should be doing that lobbying? I don't know, but
yeah, but and I think it's maybe Tom Steinberg has talked about this often in the past as well. It's like a different education for civil servants as well. You know, that actually, because technology and design, digital, whatever way you want to describe it, is such now a core element of everything going forward. It's sort of impossible to think of it, isn't it, coming into a policy role even without a deep understanding of technology, design, digital, etc.
Still happens, but you'd hope. But I think it is getting better. Like, there are more people who understand digital technology, digital services, like in significant positions compared to a decade ago.
Yeah. And that's a bit like, you know, it's the same way. I mean, I used to always think like the growth of Airbnb, for example. I mean, I worked in local government, I had a local government background. You could essentially see that, you know, the planning department was being disintermediated. So, you know, local was being disintermediated by global. What that would have actually meant was the planners would have had to go out and walk and look for lockboxes, you know, to actually, because they've no other way of trying to figure out what is happening to the world around us over which we have no control. So that kind of knowledge of technology, I think, is really important for policy people.
Yeah, I think there's a missing function, isn't there, somewhere in the public sector to understand those emerging changes and to respond with policy. So I don't mean like you know, sort of horizon scanning, write a report is the most interesting type thing, but actually spotting things like the Airbnb and kind of going, okay, what should the local government policy response be there? Like, what are the options so that government can be on the front foot a little bit more? I don't know where.
Yeah, but and part of that is, again, designing in the seams, right? I mean, because Airbnb was always described in such a, you know, motherhood and apple pie, it's your home from home anywhere. It's nobody was saying you're disintermediating the planning system, because what does that mean actually? You know, it means, well, Silicon Valley is deciding whether it's party central in the apartment block you just bought. You know what I mean? So it's people understanding. And I sometimes think the internet's so ephemeral like that. We don't see those changes until they're done to us, right?
Yeah. And you definitely saw it with the with COVID and the COVID contact tracing apps, where people were asking very rightly very challenging questions of government around privacy and data use, and demands for the code to be open sourced and understand what was happening. There was not the same clamour for transparency from Apple and Google, who pretty much said, privacy, you can trust us.
Yeah, forget about it.
Using privacy enhancing technology, so it's okay, and there's no it just shuts down the debate around the kind of political power that companies are getting. Okay, the data may be treated in a way that is privacy preserving and no one can see what's happening, but like, that does not mean that there's not a transfer of political power happening. And how do we have a debate about that as a society?
Exactly. We're coming close to the end now, Richard. Sorry, I've missed a question from Mary Neal, which is about planning. All I'd say, Mary, is Richard's written quite a bit about planning in the book, so maybe you can find it there. Otherwise, thanks a million for that, Richard. Really enjoyable. I'm going to hand you back to Emma.
That was absolutely fantastic. What a canter through so many different topics and issues. Thank you. And it was great to allow loads of time for questions from what was a very engaged audience. I think at the height we had about 200 people on the webinar, which is great to see. So just to remind everybody, we will be publishing the webinar. So if you didn't get a chance to see all of it, or if you want to watch back, we'll be publishing it on the ODI website and promoting it. But for now, there are the details of Richard's book, Platformland, on the screen. Highly recommend. There's a QR code that you can use if you've got time. And it just remains for me to say a very big thank you to Emer Coleman and Richard Pope. Thank you both so much.